In this episode, we converse with Professor Jeremy Monteiro, who is regarded as one of the foremost jazz pianists in Asia and has been referred to as Singapore's King of Swing. He has more than 25 jazz albums to his name and has played on numerous other jazz albums, including one by Grammy Award-winning saxophonist Ernie Watts. Jeremy was also conferred the prestigious Cultural Medallion Award in 2002 for his contributions to Singapore's music scene. Joining Jeremy in this discussion is Dr. Samuel Wong, the co-founder and creative director of the Teng Company. Teng is one of the largest music companies in Singapore, and Sam spearheads the company's artistic innovation, social impact, and industry empowerment division. In 2021, Sam was listed in Prestige Magazine's 40 Under 40 list of Singapore's most successful, influential, and innovative young people. This episode is truly special as we cover topics that range from jazz music in Singapore to Chinese classical music and many other cultural genres and its role in creating a unique Singapore sound. Okay, so we're down for this episode with Big Bro JM in the house and Sam from the Teng Company. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me today.
Thank you.
So let's get started with, of course, Jeremy. We are very honored to have you here today. And you are a huge inspiration for me, and I'm pretty sure for Sam and for many, many, many musicians in the fraternity. Longevity is one thing which everybody struggles with, especially these days in the very fleeting music industry. Constantly people are being replaced, people are being forgotten. But when you say Jeremy Monteiro, everybody knows. So that's the thing, which is, I think, truly inspiring, and we can learn from that. And it's like a lot of roads lead to Jeremy Monteiro. If you ask a lot of people, they would have told you that, JM helped me with this, JM helped me with that kind of thing. So it's not just ensuring that your career has got the longevity, but at the same time, you ensure that other people's career is able to kind of take off and propel to a different degree. And all that is truly inspiring for me. And you've seen a lot. You've seen a lot of changes the industry has gone through from the early days, with your work with Hugh Harrison and coming into the scene, doing the NDP songs. And not just jazz, right? You've done so many other things as well in other genres as well. It's not just jazz, but jazz is the frontline. I think people know for that, who is Jeremy Monteiro based on the jazz scene, but also there's so much other work that the personality, the artist, the musician, Jeremy Monteiro has done. I just want to pick your brain on this. What were the early days like when it came to the Singapore music scene, and how does the current music scene compare to that?
Well, back then I came onto the scene and started working as a professional musician in December of 1976. I was 16 and a half years old. And so actually underage, not supposed to play in clubs. And
true virgin.
My father actually came to a company. He brought me to the gig. It was a happy hour gig at the Country Club Hotel on East Coast Road. It doesn't exist anymore because my mother didn't want me to stay too late. And then, the place got kind of seedy after happy hours. So after I finished playing, I need to get out and...
Too young for that,
get out. So, and then later on, a few months later, I went to audition as a pianist at this very good jazz club called the Club 392, where the legendary Rahim Hamid and Rahima Rahim, his daughter, was singing. And not only did the club owner hire me as the pianist for the group, but at 16 and a half years old, he hired me as the band leader. So my musicians in their 30s and 40s, most of them were very kind and related to me on a musical level and didn't care about my age. One of them gave me a lot of trouble because his boss was 16 and a half years old. But I managed to somehow work out that dynamic. And it was it was just been a few years after they lifted the ban on live music in Singapore. Because for a few years there was a ban on live music in Singapore.
Yeah, that followed after the Operation Snip Snip, huh?
Yeah. And so then around 1972 they lifted the ban. So then I came onto the scene at the end of 76. So the scene was starting to revive itself, and I don't think there was many musicians as there are now, and I don't think there was many good musicians as there are now. So, but then it was still a lively scene. Luis Soliano back then was already the main guy in jazz. So he taught me a lot, took me on this win, gave me a lot of tough love. Back then, we could take tough love,
Yeah.
Nowadays, you can't really use tough love. People will actually kind of break down and so on. So you have to be nicer the way you.
Is that difficult for you to navigate through? Because you came from a very different era where, and I think I'm a migrant. Maybe Sam is a migrant also. We're probably around the same age.
I think I'm older than you.
Really? Seniors here. So I think I came from a generation where we had to work with tough love as well. But then, because you're millennial, smack in between, right? Between two generations.
Yeah.
But then you see the transition. Because I literally came from CD to, the YouTube era and stuff. Of course, you've seen from the cassette and before that, right?
Yeah.
So I did find it a bit difficult because everybody was giving me tough love in the initially when I started off, but I couldn't do that to the next generation. So I was figuring out, how do I process this thing that happened to me and make sure it's kind of agreeable to the current generation. If not, you're gonna make too many enemies. Like you gotta work with people, right? How is that for you?
Well, I think there's a fine line between tough love and downright abuse, and I experienced both of it.
Oh man.
So. I mean, the part that wasn't abused was like I was the session piano player for EMI Records by the time I got to 17 years old, 77. Played with everyone from Francis Yip to Anita Sarawak and Matthew and the Mandarins. Actually, the first album I ever recorded was a country album, Matthew and the Mandarins. And a lot of Malaysian artists like Sudirman and Sharifah Aini and all that, who are all gone now. But it was very, very exciting times. But being the new kid on the block, I also was the coffee boy lah. So even though I'm a bona fide session pianist playing on the album, when it's break time, okay, Jeremy, take the coffee orders, then go across the street to Cycle and Carriage was there, and then go and buy, the kopi and the curry puff. So, and I did that until Ken Lim came in. Then suddenly Ken Lim was the coffee boy. Right. So it was that part of it wasn't bad lah. I remember the part of the producers, I won't mention his name because in the end I actually ended up really loving him and thanking him for the like when I was playing, already so nervous my first session, right? He would talk to the music director who brought me into the studio and press the talkback button and say, "Hey, Martin, what type of lousy pianist to bring to record with me?"
Oh,
and he purposely pressed the talkback in the controller so I could hear him say that,
Man, that's
and
mean.
it made me even more. But I was at the age of the metal of that generation that instead of letting it break me down, I went back and practiced even harder and tried to get even better so that I could come back and
prove him wrong.
Prove him wrong. So like you mentioned, I'm known mostly as a jazz musician. I just released my 50th album about a couple of weeks ago. But I've also played on 300 pop albums, and I also won an award for classical music in New York. So as I think I describe my career as like an iceberg. What you see above the water level is my work in jazz, and then everything else that I do, not just music, and everything else that I do is kind of below the water level. And
I want to point out, I actually watched an interview with you and Jing Xing, and you guys talked about music and tech. As well as an AI and stuff like that. And I was, because I'm a huge fan of Jing Xing as well. And I was like, oh my God. So I think your career has actually pushed the boundary beyond just pop and all that, but it's just music in itself. And then the whole entire fact of how you are actually encompassing music, but in many different forms and taking many different types of lives and taking many different identities, but it's still uniquely you.
Yeah. For me, but at my core, I'm still a musician. If you take away the permission I have and the blessing that I have to compose and to perform, if you take that away, I think I will be completely lost. I think I'm everything else, whether, I've sat on the NAC board for 2 terms, for example, sat on the Workforce Development Agency, Manpower Skills and Training Council, and all these other things that I do. I was a co-founder of Compass, and all these other things I do would just completely collapse if you took away the music. The other people who use the music to get to, as a stepping stone to get onto the next level, whether go on to management or go on to become a producer and so on. But for me, it's not a stepping stone. It's an integral part of who I am all the way. And like I said, I would be totally lost if I didn't have, the performance and the writing of music, and to some extent the teaching of music as the core of my being and my life.
I totally relate to that because there's this interdisciplinary thing that I do for myself as well, right? Because there's the music, me as a music artist, but there's also me within music itself. I'm doing songwriting, production, composition, etc.
Film music and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I'm an executive producer for my material, and I work with other people to executive produce shows outside of music also. And then I act, and I run a company, and there's so many things going on. But I always think in terms of music. Even when I'm acting, if there are 3 actors performing a particular role, I'm always thinking, who is the root note? It starts with the triad for me, right? So who's the root note? Who's the third? Who's the fifth? I'm thinking like that. And what are we playing? What are we playing? And what's the energy like? Who's going to harmonize? Who's going to be dissonant? Who's going to sow a discord in the scene? I'm always thinking in terms of that. And then when I have team meetings, I always think about like the flow of an ensemble. Like how can we work together as a band? So I totally relate to that. Like for us, music is our grammar, to navigate even the world itself, even when we do other things. So I can kind of connect to that. Sam, how does it work for you? Like, you are bridging between being the creative director of Tongue and you're a musician yourself. What are the challenges you face?
I think that I don't see them as very separate things. I always just see them as just one thing, but you're just doing multiple shades of the same thing. So I don't actually separate it a lot. I think what's unique is because of my background, where I actually approach music from a very research perspective. So a lot of Tongue's works, for example, is very research-based or evidence-based in that sense. So it comes from a slightly academic perspective, but how are we able to use music to actually be put through academia, but put into an applied perspective? I think from that lens, that's where I might differ from a few other musicians, where a lot of them actually deal with the artistic impulse or the creative impulse, where they want to perform, they want to showcase, they want to write, they want to express. So I come from a very, I would say, this is a very unmusical, but I come from a very logical framework. The way I think tends to be in blocks. And then subsequently, I organize them. I think it's to do with my personality also. I'm quite OCD and I'm always in white, kind of thing. So I work. And same way, Shabir, I notice for you, it's because of your grounding in philosophy and your interest in philosophy. The root note can be expounded into your meetings, which can expound into your life and all that. So I think perhaps if I put it in a very logical way, 2 aspects. Number 1, the critical thinking aspect. Number 2, the heart. When we do something, are our hearts in the right place? Are our minds in the right place? And then a lot of people I know may have the right heart, but they have the worst ways of doing it, and it really fails. Or some people may actually have the best ways of doing it, but they really have the worst hearts. And then when these things actually happen, so I try to combine these 2 together to find the most effective, the most evidence-based way to actually do something that's musical, artistic, and creative, but yet actually also encompass the heart, the software, the ideas, the values that you're actually doing so. And in so being sort of combining them together and finding a way through. And I suppose that is I recognize as a little bit different in the way that I've taught. I mean, I've grown up with so many musicians. I've grown up also listening to your music as well. I've grown up with so many musicians, largely because I started music at a pretty young age. And when the national music competitions, we all kind of won them at a very young age. I did not expect that I was going to do music as a career. I was too young. You just won. There was this thing called the national music competition, and then the next thing you know, you won, and you go into there's this prize winners concert, and then you get catapulted onto a stage, and then suddenly everybody knows you. So and that was when I was pretty young, and there was something that I think needs to be known is that prodigies grow up. They don't remain young forever. They grow older. And I think for me, why I created sort of this way of thinking was realizing that a lot of contemporaries, a lot of friends of mine who were together with me, the prodigies, started growing up. And then they might have had a certain amount of talent at a very young age, but they didn't know how to grow that talent or how to find a unique identity for themselves, how to create a career for themselves, how to create longevity in whatever they were doing in terms of music. And then subsequently also how to actually have a unique identity in which other people will be able to recognize them for their art, for their craft. So through this process, going through the experiences that I have, that is why I think I approached it with added with my personality. I approached music with a very research lens.
Right.
Yeah, and I'm sure that comes in handy for Tung, right?
Yeah, I think the problem with Tung's products is that everything seems to be very research based right now, and I blame it on me. It's really my fault. So it sometimes feels a little bit I don't think it's as free as I would say Shabia's your music or Jeremy's your music. There's an internal input. A lot of my work comes out with a lot of, it's like Lego, it's like building Lego. Whereas, so it doesn't come naturally for, the musicality doesn't come naturally like for you, Shabia, and for you, Jeremy. You both, it's just inside, For me, I will look at the music, listen to it, and I break it down into molecule by molecule and reconstruct it. It's a totally different approach of looking at music.
But it's a great, interesting approach as well.
It is, right? Yeah, he's more like a mathematician.
Yeah. So
music is actually intuitive math.
It is. For sure.
So I'm known to be incredibly technical in that sense. My approach to music, and Tung has always been very slick, very clean, very technical in that sense, and that's why the products that we create always have a research component behind it, and it's an evidence-based component.
But is that something that the Chinese music scene, Chinese classical music scene needed? Was that the need of the hour that Tung was also
I don't think it was
to?
needed per se. I just think that nobody did it.
Right.
Because most of Chinese music tends to be traditionally, that it was always very philosophical in that sense. But I think because I studied both in the UK and I studied both in China, I became a confluence of these two things actually happening at once. And of course, then I was taking academic principles that I was learning from the UK and onto aesthetic principles that I was learning from China and then mashing it together. And then bringing it back to Singapore. And then when we created stuff, I just think that nobody actually created it at that period of time. And frankly speaking, at that period of time when I was just started Tung, I didn't really know what I was doing. But I just imbued it, and I just realized that if you have good form, you can be able to create good meaning. If you have bad form, meaning bad technique or whatever, it's very difficult for you to, despite you actually having internal creative impetus to want to say something, you'll be limited by the level of technique that you have. And that's why I find a lot of young people have a lot of problems with. They don't put in the hours to actually work on technique.
Yeah. There's this joke about how this guy, the father saw him leaving home and said, "Where are you going?" "Oh, I'm going for my bass guitar lesson." Okay, then he comes back later and says, "What do you learn?" "Oh, we learn the C major scale." "Oh, okay." The next week, the kid comes back and says, "So what do you learn this week?" "Oh, this year I learned the C minor scale." "Oh, very good." The next week, he's taking his bass, he's leaving. He said, "Where are you going?" "Oh, I'm off to a gig."
I think that's the current situation with the whole social media, era, where people get instant gratification. Like they learn something and they put it up on social media. Immediately you get likes and comments and stuff like that. And people like that. They enjoy that, you see. But that's one thing that I do believe that the current generation, they may not understand. It's not their fault. I do believe it's nobody's fault. It's just the way things are. And primarily, it's social media that changes the behavior of people, where they think that, I can do this and tune this way and put it out and immediately get some likes and get away with it. But then when they come live and they're supposed to sing live, they are unable to deliver it in that manner. And that becomes a huge problem. How do you think we can bridge this gap as music artists who are already in the scene? We understand this struggle. They have interest, as what Sam pointed out. They have an artistic impetus. They might have very bright ideas, but without the technique, you will not be able to execute these ideas and bring it to fruition, right? How do you think we can bridge this gap without... there's also... The social media thing is also very real, because if you don't have a presence now, people You might be very good, but if nobody knows who you are and what you're doing, nobody's gonna know about it, and gone are the days where it'll come to me. It doesn't come to you anymore, actually. You gotta go out there, seek, connect, and let people know. How can we bridge this difference between, the wisdom that the previous generation has and the next generation? How can this wisdom be transmitted to them?
I think, to be fair, there are many very talented and very disciplined young artists and musicians as well who put in the time. For example, I recently played a concert with Resound Collective, which is when I say recently, it's 2 years. As recently, I released an album of that concert in February, and I was so shocked because there were 5 rehearsals, and when I came to rehearsal number 1, they nailed everything already. We could have actually played the concert at night. That's how good they were and how prepared they came to the first rehearsal. And so then I had 4 more rehearsals, so we only had to sheen things and work on phrasing and dynamics. We didn't have to talk about wrong notes or not playing together because they were really on it from the get-go. So that really impressed me a lot about musicians coming to a rehearsal to rehearse, not coming to a rehearsal to practice. Practice at home, right? But the ethic before was practice on the first 2 rehearsals. Then you start rehearsing. I mean, very often I will see that. And I think in Singapore, actually, there's less and less of that now. I'm quite, like for the Jazz Association musicians, they come pretty prepared now but then I went overseas and played. I won't mention which country, And the first rehearsal was, oh no, we're not going to be able to make it. We're not going to be able to make the concert in 5 days' time because I need 2 weeks with these people. But then they could see the look of horror in my face, and I without being rude or too strong, I think I impressed upon them how much work they have to do. So they actually went back and practiced like 3, 4, 5 hours on their own.
You guilt-tripped them.
Yeah, and then the next day, still cannot make it. But by the third rehearsal, it's starting to,
take shape.
It's starting to take shape. And actually, we ended up doing a decent show together, and it ended up, but shouldn't have to be like that.
Shouldn't be like that, yeah.
So like I said, there are young people who are very disciplined here in Singapore, and I think it's not a lack of discipline or inspiration or impetus, but you will find that the ones that are quick to jump onto social media to show what they can do are the ones who cannot play or cannot sing. The ones who actually can play and sing, they understand delayed gratification already. They will wait until they get good enough.
You will get longevity, you see, with your careers. Because the ones who can play for whatever social media thing, it will just be this number of posts. And then after that, you cannot attract anybody else because there's nothing else new.
Certainly.
Yeah, that's do you see that happening in your scene, or is it a bit different for you?
I think generally it's a generational thing. It's a work ethic that we are talking about. It's and anybody who is responsible, who is committed, who will put in the time, who respects the craft, regardless of whether it's music or not, will be on time, will be blah, 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 be prepared. It's a work ethic thing that we are talking about. And then I think that we are seeing right now is that social media has allowed for a sense of instant gratification that has happened. And the second thing that has happened is that there is a rapid consumption. So because there's a rapid consumption, let's say on TikTok, one is used to actually consuming multiple or copious amounts of data in a very short period of time. And when you get that, your brain becomes very stimulated, and you need to swipe, and and in the process of actually swiping, you don't necessarily feel everything moves a lot faster in that sense. So let's pull it back to the context of learning an instrument. If someone were to learn an instrument, we all know from the basics you just need to practice. And what a practice basically means is basically taking something and repeating it over and over again, using one's head, using one's physiological fingers, etc., using one's voice, and then perfecting it until it gets right. So what we have is actually a situation where the environment makes it very conducive to move very quickly. And as such, it is not psychologically immediate gratification. You don't get immediate gratification from actually practicing and doing something slow in that sense. So what I think one person needs is to build resilience, that you are prepared to actually work on something while everybody else is going fast. You will stay slow, you will stay committed to your craft, and then you will slowly reap the rewards because you are building something that has a longevity rather than 10 posts. There's nothing else to do in that sense. And so I think this is a fundamental of learning all skills, essentially. And this is a trait or a situation that we are facing with a lot of young people. And I know this because I teach in a university and I teach so many young people. And I've taught, literally 15 years, and I've seen the generations, and I realize that the tendency or the need for immediate gratification grows stronger and stronger and stronger because the community in which a lot of these students actually sort of work around in, actually their friends are actually experiencing immediate gratification in that sense. And the social media is becoming more and more powerful with a lot more short form video. So I think what's important is in education that we need to actually let our young people know, well, as you study this is going to take long, but the results will be reaped in, you be consistent, be constant, the results will come, and the results will be there for a very long time.
I think the experience is slightly different for, Jeremy and yourself, probably because you are, teaching, you meet a lot of students, but people come to play with Jeremy, like, we're playing with Jeremy, let's not f*** around him, let's get our act together.
No, Jeremy, you teach too.
Beat that out of
For sure, yeah.
You teach too, right, Jeremy?
I do, but less than I used to. Now I just, I am a visiting professor in 3 universities around the world, but I go and do my twice a year visiting and do my 1.5 hour lecture, play a concert, and so they're not really the classroom oriented that you have to experience, and which I used to do before, of course, when I was more active in LaSalle. But I think it's true. I mean, I still have the same situation. And once in a while, when I get to play with Randy Brecker as a 7-time Grammy Award winner, I still feel like, I better don't, mess around.
Because it's also your own professionalism and pride, when you come into the rehearsal studio. Yeah.
How's the scene changed based on your observation from the early days to now, the jazz scene in particular?
Well, firstly, I've said this before, that we have more high-level jazz musicians in Singapore now than we've ever had in our history. Not to disrespect the ones who really have reached the high mountains like Luis Soliano and Ronaldo La Chica and John Lee is my uncle by marriage, who was and so many of these wonderful musicians who existed, who were active then. Luis is still active at 81, talk about longevity, right?
Yeah.
So I think it has changed in that. Firstly, there's a lot more high-level musicians. So, you have on the one hand people like Chokorong, you have Wei Xiang Tan, and, Sean Hong Wei is only 25 years old, already one of the top jazz musicians in New York. Sean lives he's studying now, he's a Jazz Association Singapore scholar, studying in New York now, and one of the great jazz musicians in Singapore told me that Sean plays better than half the saxophone players in New York now. So it's so proud, right? You feel like a Singaporean. So we have high-level musicians. We have a problem, there's not enough venues to play. And the other thing is that, back in my time, I started in 76, but basically in the 80s, you play in a jazz club, you get $150. Today, you still get $150 or $200.
Oh, man, really?
Yeah, and you think about it, talking about the sidemen, like for me, I'll say what I want, and if you don't give it to me, then no need. But but all you're willing to pay the sidemen is $150 to $200 still, after 40 years. But you look at inflation, you talk about inflation, but everyone else's salaries have gone up, right?
For sure. Yeah.
But the freelance musicians, the jazz musicians are still getting the similar kind of, not for concerts or corporate gigs, of course, they get a lot more money, they can get $400 to $100 to $1,000 for a corporate gig, right? And
of course, there's also the situation of, do I need to pay you? I'm giving you a platform that's there also.
Yeah.
People who even think that you don't even need to pay.
Do you still get that nowadays?
I had a couple of people on the show, and they told me that it happens a lot. Like people tell them that, but you're getting a platform. So why should I pay you? I'm giving you a platform. I was like baffled when I heard that. Really? People say these kind of things these days?
Yeah. Now then you have to try and control your temper because I mean I would blow my top.
I don't know.
Said it to me 25 years ago, but nowadays I just look at them like you got to be out of your mind. You know? I mean, basically, and then the other thing I really is interesting is that you go to a party. Hey, you didn't bring your piano. And I feel like telling the dentist, you didn't bring your dental chair to give everyone a free tooth cleaning, is it? Teeth cleaning. I mean, it's so disrespectful.
Yeah.
I mean, I have said that in the past, but now I don't, but I think it, you know.
You manifest it.
You used to have anger issues.
Huh?
Did you used to have anger issues?
I used to have anger issues. I mean, I was talking before we were recording about how I used to be, I've been doing this for 48 years. I've been in the professional scene for 48 years. And maybe, 25, 30 years ago, I used to be a lot more arrogant and very impatient with people. And I've learned to be, people who know me for the last 25 years or 30 years think that I'm a real nice teddy bear kind of guy. But I say, and I think back of the people who put up with me back in the old days, right? So yeah, I mean, I think in my book I should call myself a recovering assholic.
I like that term.
Some people, when they get older, they become grumpier and more impatient, and some people become more patient. And I'm really glad I become the more patient and the more understanding and the slower to anger. And not act on an impulse. I can notice my anger, honor the feeling, and then choose not to act out. And that's
right.
Because they say the definition of maturity is being able to entertain a notion without necessarily acting out.
Everybody needs a rope in life to hold on to sometimes when we are in our darkest hours and we are, in the dungeon. We need the rope to just hold on to it. Maybe we don't have the strength to climb out yet, but we just need to hold on to it and not let go, right? And for some people, it could be the Bible. For some people, it could be a person. Some people, it could be a philosophy. For me, it happens to be music. It happens to be art. It happens to be poetry. And I think what took me out from the whole, my gangster phase, in my teenage years and early 20s is definitely music. If I did not take the path of music, I think I would have taken that path. Because, kid you not, I go for Yellow Ribbon Project to judge, and someone was playing there and I recognize the face and it's my ex-gangmate. So I was thinking that, this could be reversed. I could be there. And someone else could come and could have judged me, if I had taken that path. And I really think music saved me. I'm very, very, very convinced about that. Music is the thing that saved me from a lot of things, including my own rage and anger, And as I went on, I spent more time in practice, as I spent more time writing lyrics, reading more poetry, reading more books. I think it makes you more compassionate, more empathetic, more gentle in that sense. And then boxing helps me retain my aggression. So now there's refinement and aggression, I hope. With the current journey that I'm taking.
Compartmentalization.
Or refined aggression.
But
refined aggression.
Just listen to you talk and even thinking about my own journey I realized how important the arts is, in society.
For sure.
Absolutely.
Actually, when you think about it, back even in very primal days, when in early man and so on and so forth, right? One of the most important people in the tribe is the shaman, right? And the shaman actually back then was, organized the rain dance for the weather, the ones that, led the drawing of the paintings in the caves, or the rituals, the dance rituals around the fire, and thankful for a good hunt or whatever it is.
Or harvest
harvest and so on. Later on when we started to farm. But even, we've only been farmers for 20,000 years, but when we go back to the tens of thousands of years ago, when man first appeared. So the shaman is very important. So actually the shaman was the entertainment services director way back then, and it was also the healer, right? The person that used to heal, the person was a spiritual leader. Of course, now you find that the doctor, we have doctors and nurses, so that has been split away from our role. The healing has been split away from our
also
role.
The psychiatrist, the psychologist of the village.
So that's all been split away from our role. But I think that at the end of the day, when you think about us artists and musicians, we are still, in a sense, a shaman, for our village.
Totally agree.
And helping people to find peace and find inspiration. And so I think we're very lucky living in Singapore, where the government actually recognizes this and the kind of support we get in our arts. I mean, I travel around the world. I can tell you there's not this kind of support in the arts in America anymore. Back then, that's why you created your Irving Berlins and your George Shearings and so on and so forth. But right now, I mean, George Gershwins and so on. But right now, there isn't that kind of support. In the UK, everything's so about just sustenance and trying to not let poverty happen. And so arts, although they are great artists and still great museums and so on, it starts to recede in terms of importance. So we are very lucky here. It's still very, very important.
Yep.
And I hope that, the powers that be to never lose sight of the fact of how important that is. I mean, I want to share, Queen Victoria once said, though, be careful of singers, actors, dancers, and artists, for they are dangerous people. And later on, when asked, why do you think they are dangerous people? It's because they talk to people of all levels of society.
It's the influence.
We talk from the dustbin man all the way to the president, literally, and all points in between. And we treat everyone the same. The dynamic, I believe that we would speak to a trash man who's carrying our garbage, and the way we is more or less the same demeanor, and so on and so forth. And I think that's why we are, I think, important, just as the sports people are. You're both, you're artists and you're a sports, you're boxing. When Joseph Schooling just decided to retire. And I actually commented, I think you have no idea how much you inspired me.
Yeah.
Even though I was already in approaching my 60s as a musician, because the way you work to attain the goal made me work much harder. People see me now like, why am I working harder than I did 10 years ago? And one of the reasons is just seeing the effort that Joseph Schooling put in and how inspired the entire nation. So I think sportsmen and artists, I always say the arts is feeds the soul of the nation, and sports feeds the morale of the nation.
And that's why artists and sportsmen, athletes, are the ones who can really create a very energetic inspiration among young people, as opposed to other professions. They're all very important, of course, but the one that makes young people imagine and dream, I want to grow up and become like this person, that power rests within artists and athletes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think last week I just gave an interview to 938, and we were talking a little bit about this issue, and there's some shots of this issue that I remember. And, we earn money to live, but what do we live for? So I think it's where you have the arts, where you actually have things like the intangibles, family, feelings, emotions, patriotism. These are things that you actually live for. And the arts very squarely actually falls within this category. I learned, this was not really a concept that was pushed by me, but it was, when Sing Sing interviewed you, she was at Oxford University and she was giving a whole entire lecture on the future of China's arts. And she says that, at your point of crisis when you're about to die and all that, you don't think about money.
Yeah,
you think about everything, like, your culture, your religion, your background, your society, your family. These are things that you basically live for.
Yeah. And I do believe that art and spirituality are intertwined in that sense. Music and spirituality is intertwined. And as what Jeremy mentioned, it is something which allows us to transcend our lesser selves, our egos, and all the petty things, and put it all aside and just become something greater, even if it's for the moment. But the residue always stays. When you transcend, you know that, I actually grew a little more compared to what I am right now. My heart expanded a little bit more. I want to retain that experience and experience it again and again. That's what makes us return to art. And that's the thing that also took me away from something as petty and meaningless as, getting into fights and brawls and things like that. The Prophet Muhammad said that every one of you is a shepherd, and you have your own flock to take care of. Yeah. And I think that's what, Jeremy was also mentioning, where we have responsibilities. He did once in a conversation say that we have our own constituencies. And the government recognizes that. Like every time when we speak to people whether it's in front of a live audience or on our social media, we are addressing a group of people, and we have the responsibility to either nurture them or guide them or touch their hearts through our music and our art. We have got that constant responsibility, you see. When I look at that, I always feel that music and the arts have got a huge role to play in nation building and national identity. It's something which I completely have faith in. I really think that it could be used as a way to allow young people to understand better about ourselves. I do believe that we leaning into our roots, our culture, our language and our history and our arts is something which gives us more confidence on the global stage as Singaporeans, because being a Singaporean, it could mean different things to different people. If you ask the same question, what does it mean to be a Singaporean? The answers are going to be very different. But I always believe that there is something more than just being known for food and skyscrapers and economic hub. And I feel like it's time we get to be known for our arts as well. We must be known for our arts and our music on the global stage. What do you think is the role of music and arts in building national identity? And how can we... It's a great relationship that we have right now where the government is supporting. I've sat personally in the EP grant, with NAC, and I've helped to assess a few of the, submissions, and they're all so good. You realize there's so many good artists who are coming up. How can we take this forward, and how can it be an agent, music and art, to build identity?
Well, firstly, government has helped a lot of artists to go and perform, including myself. Although I never actually, it took me many, many years, I think at least 2 decades before I even tried to apply for my first, that I even wanted to apply for my first grant. And it was to go and perform at the Jazz Yatra Festival in Mumbai. And it was great to be able, because that festival actually doesn't pay any artists. So even like when Dizzy Gillespie went to play there, it was the US State Department who paid for him to go there. And it was great. Even for many years, people would support their artists to go and perform at the Jazz Yatra. But I think the problem with a small place, small town, so it doesn't even have to be countries, small towns, is that, a prophet is never accepted in his own land. So basically, the artist has to have made noise outside. Then they will go, oh, wow. I mean, take again the example of Joseph Schooling, right? See, you have to do that, and then all of a sudden you're...
I had to go to India.
You had to go to India, then you go... So me, I had to go and perform on the main stage in the Montreal Jazz Festival, and many other artists have had this same struggle. You have to make noise outside, get accepted, And we have a lot of artists in Singapore who have gone to do really well. There's a guy called Lenny Wee, I don't know if you know who he is. He's actually was the deputy music director for American Idol for all these years. And then he was also the deputy music director for the Jay Leno show when he was hosting the Tonight Show. And you have Wong Kah-chun, our conductor, who's conducted the Nuremberg Symphony Orchestra and he's conducting a much higher level orchestra, the Dresden Symphony Orchestra, and many others. There's so many. These are the ones that we know from recent times, right? And who have gone and made noise outside before they were accepted locally. I mean, back in the old days, the Quest, remember the Reggie Wilkins and all that they used to actually, they were accepted and chased after like the Beatles in Singapore, even though they didn't really make a lot of noise outside Singapore. But that has changed. Yeah. For some reason now, Singaporeans are so brand conscious, whether it's cars or bags or artists, you have to have a brand. And I think part of the reason for that, unfortunately, is the attitude and philosophy behind broadcasting. So they do not play local artists enough on, say, the English channels, and they just will not. Now, for example, my music only ever gets played on radio in Singapore when I'm doing an interview. Then they will play my tracks. But in the US, I've been in the top 50 of the jazz charts 3 times in the last 3 years. Why is it they play? No doubt I got to put effort in, I have to hire publicists and so on and so forth. But why is it that you refuse to play? Not just me lah. There's a whole story before Charlie Lim can get one song on. You know what I mean? And it's really very sad. In Canada, actually, they actually built an entire industry on legislating that you must have 10 minutes of local music every hour on the radio. That's why you have your Avril Lavigne, your Michael Bublé and all this, because they were forced to play.
Right.
Singapore will not take that on because it's actually against WTO rules and globalization rules. But I think sometimes this kind of local thing, just do it lah. Who's going to complain? Everybody in every country bends the WTO rules a little bit to help, the locals get ahead, And I think that they should. I mean, so much great musicians out there that should get a lot more airplay, especially with Indian music. At least you get better chance. Malay music, better chance. Chinese music, better chance to get the local musicians on. But English music, no, It's almost impossible to get on, to be played on the radio. And then they said, because there's no name recognition. Yeah, there's no name recognition because you don't allow to create any local name recognition, right? They're only guided by the top 40 charts.
Absolutely. And I think this is actually a very vicious cycle that actually happens. Because of that, my students actually do some research studies as to why do young people actually listen to local music? Or what do young people think about local music? And a lot of them think that the standard is impressions that's actually inferior to the music that they actually hear from blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And so we understand that their impressions is inferior, the exposure is low, and a lot of them basically don't know enough. And so this is where I wonder for myself, is policy or legislation going to be able to help us push this up forward? Because it is not one community that needs to work. It's multiple parts of an equation that need to work simultaneously and symbiotically so that this can be all uplifted. For example, in K-pop, that there's a department of K-pop in the Korean government.
Yeah. K-pop was completely orchestrated to a large degree by the government itself.
And so there's a whole huge soft power narrative that basically happens here. I think we take an approach where you do and we support a little bit, but it's not like we front and come, let's go and do it together kind of thing. And I don't think that this is primarily in a lot of the agenda on a lot of the legislators' minds right now. So I think we might need to actually make a case to actually push for this agenda, because this will uplift the whole music industry. Right. And that we might need to somebody needs to do the numbers, like do number crunching, because our government's very good at number crunching. So it's like, if we do this, how much in return do we get? How much do the creative industries actually result in jobs, income, GDP, blah, 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 blah. We've seen the power of Taylor Swift, in Singapore. But then what do we need for Singaporeans to actually go onto a larger stage, ASEAN, global, East, West, etc. I think one of the biggest brands that we have in Singapore that actually went onto a global stage and is famous for going to a global stage is Singapore Airlines. If we have managed to do that with a Singapore Airlines by ensuring like almost top of the class quality, top of the class infrastructure, and and there are airlines that compete with them all the time, for like best airline kind of thing. But if we already had the capability to create a Singapore Airlines, then why can't we have the capability of creating a Singapore brand or Singapore style music?
I think it's totally possible. And as you mentioned, it's moving parts and a lot of, people need to come together. And of course, when we start verbalizing something like that, we are immediately looking at institutions, private and public, government bodies, musicians themselves, people, broadcasters, everyone coming together and getting on the same page. And while there's been a lot of support, in many areas and different ways, sometimes we are caught also observing that we're working in silos. And maybe, we need something which is a well-coordinated effort where everyone can come together. Maybe in the past it may not have worked very well, but as Jeremy correctly pointed out, now there are a lot of musicians and very good musicians. And we also have, musicians who have already made it on the global stage, like Jeremy himself and many others, who are here in Singapore, to kind of mentor them and guide them. So I think it is right. It is the right time for all the parties to come together and create something which is a consistent and continuous effort that can bear fruit. And I do believe that one of the things that we have that is special, a Singaporean musician that has is special compared to a musician from the West, for an example, is the fact that we are multicultural. We speak more than one language. We understand the sensitivity of other cultures. And I think that's a superpower that we have.
Yeah.
But of course, I wish we have more platforms to explore that superpower that we have. And let's start with Jeremy, where, Asiana, it's a great composition. I love it. It's been performed by, so many different orchestras, and you have reinterpreted it multiple times as well. And the whole show, which I think you have not put out yet, Kaleidoscope, was a huge experiment, which I enjoyed very much personally. And I think that is a mark of a Singaporean musician really going, crazy with what he could do with all these resources that's available. And what's interesting about that is that kind of production can possibly only happen in a country like Singapore, produced by a Singaporean artist. What do you think about that potent, power that we hold, multiculturalism, and how can it be explored further? And how can it be something that's sort of an impetus for us to explore the global stage with that kind of consciousness as a Singaporean?
Well, actually, it's an interesting question, and maybe I'm not entirely hopeful about this, because I mentioned about how when we did Kaleidoscope, there was this couple that came to the show, my friends visiting from Australia. And the husband was very enamored to see this multiculturalism and coming together of the different songs and all. But then but the wife said, I came to see a jazz concert and I didn't see anybody singing a Frank Sinatra song or whatever it is. And because people are very set in their ways of what they want to consume. I mean, you people talk about how sophisticated they want to be, but they walk into a Thai restaurant, they still order pad Thai. It doesn't matter if there's 200 things on the menu. At the end of the day, I'll have a pad Thai and green curry, and that's it. There's only the few people willing to explore. So, for one thing, is I found that this thing that I do, this multicultural thing, Kaleidoscope, it was very hard to sell tickets. Right. I mean, we got a lot of, we've had the government officials that came say, this must be seen by more people. We would like you to reprise this show, and we did reprise the show, but ended up that it wasn't even harder selling tickets the next time around. This is a Jazz Association's presentation. So then we know, are people even ready to receive, Sometimes it's not the right timing for people to receive.
Right.
And the global tide is actually against coming together. Unfortunately, even if you look at America now, how people that used to act as a family 30, 40, 50 years ago are at each other's throats. You even find that that nowadays Republicans and Democrats won't even sit together for a meal. Which is unheard of. You can't even imagine this happening in the world today, And so I feel, and it may sound very selfish, I think we need to just look after ourselves, and maybe the good example some people will notice, and if they're willing to listen, meaning they're willing to bring these multicultural groups to perform in the other countries, and then we do it. As for exporting, the rest of the world has only got an appetite for example, you do your fantastic Indian pop music, the quality is good, they're going to ask you to do it in India. Or wherever the Indian languages are spoken. You do your tongue stuff, your fusion with the Chinese and the Western influence. Some forward-thinking arts company in Guangdong or whatever will say, hey, bring it here. We want to have it here to share how we can bring together different races and so on and so forth. But there was an appetite for things like Asia Bagus before. Remember Najib?
Oh my gosh.
Right? There was an appetite for, I don't know if the global appetite is there for that now.
I do think that corporate leaders and corporate enterprises are also very supportive.
Yeah.
I can easily name, I think Jeremy also can easily name, Tung can name, like we have all been supported by corporate enterprises. Like for me, it's like the big three for me is Ilongo from Casuarina and Halal Foods and MES, Mr. Jalil Pandian from Halal Foods. I walk in, first album I'm producing, a second album I'm producing, and I'm asking, for X amount of money. And they said, how much do you need? And then when I say the money and then the amount, it comes back 5 minutes later with a check straight up. No questions asked. Okay, go ahead and do it. So there is all these support that they're willing to. It's just that the effort needs to be kind of orchestrated in a more organized fashion. And I think we can benefit from it.
Yeah.
The work that Teng does, during the course of my research, I did realize that the Chinese traditional classical music scene has come a very long way from the inception, like pre-colonial times, where Western, art critics and observers used to observe. And I did read a passage where they said that it's got a long way to go, to now today, where it's very organized, it's properly notated, and there are organizations and orchestras which are playing. And I'm pretty sure there was a transformation that that the scene had to go through. A lot of institutional effort need to come in. How do you think? What kind of role do you think an organization like the Teng Company plays in empowering Singaporeans, getting in touch with their roots, their culture, their identity? What is the importance? What's the role you think the Teng Company plays in that?
I think you need to look at the past to make sense of your present. And I've always believed that. So a lot of times when we grow, as Shabir, you mentioned earlier, we ask ourselves, what is our identity? Who are we? What are we doing? What do we represent? Teng comes, I think Teng's role when I first started it at that period of time was to actually bring Chinese music to the world and beyond. And because of that, I think one of the first projects that I did was I wrote a book in English. And it was the first English book about Chinese instruments in English. And then this was about in 2005. So it was almost 20 years ago. And then people in America started buying it. People in Europe started buying it. And then it started becoming textbooks in some music faculties overseas as well. Because there was no such resource in being able to explain how to write for Chinese instruments in English.
You mean no such resource in the whole world?
No.
Really? Not even from the mainland?
No, not mainland China. They had it in Chinese, but they never had it in English.
Oh, wow.
So this is where I think the whole Singaporean thing came about, because I was bicultural and I was bilingual in a sense. And because of that, I was actually able to take this resource and then so if people who know Teng internationally, they just think of us as from the book. They just think, Teng is that resource book that we created, kind of thing, And so that's our claim to fame internationally. In Singapore, it's a whole entire host of social projects that we do and stuff like that. But I've always thought that we could combine the best of East and the best of West, and then we could actually put them together and we could actually sort of export it. So it's a little bit like pulling back on Singapore's own heritage. Well, we were an export nation in the first place. We were I personally felt that from my own experiences, I was importing various different cultures and then subsequently making it our own and exporting it out to the world. So I think that was, and that is still our contribution. And then subsequently taking, as I mentioned earlier, very Western sort of ideals of research, putting them into traditional Chinese music and putting them together and working something out. For example, our recent one of our recent albums, which we call Music for Mindfulness, we actually researched this with Singapore Institute of Technology over 2 years during the pandemic. We took the ancient principles of Chinese music therapy, where they believe, like the Chinese medicine, you need to have a yin and yang. They believe that the 5 notes correspond to wellness. So you have all the 5 elements, 金木水火土, which is fire, water, and then you put them together, and you need to hear them together, and then before you can actually get a sense of mental well-being. Subsequently, we took the Western technology of binaural beats and we merged it together, and then we created a product called Music for Mindfulness.
Is there a resource to check this out?
It's on Singapore Airlines right now.
The link is below.
No, so you can go to Singapore Airlines and you can actually listen. You can actually listen to it. So that is the tech or innovation kind of bit. Last year, I went to Hong Kong. And I was giving a keynote lecture at Chinese University of Hong Kong. And I realized Hong Kong at that period of time, the government was actually moving to a thrust of art and tech. And so I brought my binaural beats project over and I showed it to them. Their jaws just dropped. And I said, because immediately when they were thinking of art and tech, they were thinking about AR and VR, virtual reality, augmented reality. But when I showed them, so this is our our headphones, which uses binaural beats, and it has been proven by Singapore Institute of Technology, and we've run it over a study of 150 students, that it's been proven to reduce anxiety and stress. If you listen to it for 30 minutes, your heart rate goes down and your sweat glands actually stop sweating in that sense. So there's evidence-based in that sense. And when they found out about it, they just, we didn't think about that, because I was merging art, science, tech, and tradition that has been put together
to offer therapy.
Yeah, so that's where Tung actually comes in. We find gaps in society, and we ask ourselves, can we use music to fill those gaps? Can we use music to fulfill society's problems? In musicology, there's a term for this, and it's called applied musicology. And so we actually, I approach Tung in such a way. Now, with regard to tradition, I think in 2016 to 2018 or so, I did a project called the Forefathers Project, where I went to all these old uncles and aunties from the various clan associations and the various dialect groups. And I went to record their music, and I went to ask them, Uncle, Auntie, what do you sing? What's the music that you play? And so I was doing field work, and I played in this place called Taoyong Music Association in Geylang. I played every Saturday with these uncles and aunties. And the person I played with was this person called Mr. Yo Hao Jiang. He was the founder of the first Singapore Chinese orchestra. This was in the 1950s or so, in that sense. But there, from him, I learned a few things. Number one, innovation is part of the Singaporean DNA. Because while they were inheritors of tradition, they were innovating by creating their own music with these Teochew instruments. They were also creating their own instruments. So most of the times in traditional music, a lot of our strings are made of silk or sometimes steel. But because we were in Singapore, a lot of these uncles and aunties, they took these strings and they made them of fishing wire. Because fishing wire was available in Singapore, because Singapore's a port. So as I said, we look to the past to make sense of the present. And similarly from them, I also learned that the government actually accused a lot of them for being communist at a period of time. And because they were communists, they stopped touching their music. They didn't dare touch their music at all. So there was a glut in the period of time in Singapore's history where some people refused to touch Chinese music for being afraid of being labeled communist, and there was a huge communist crackdown. It was only suddenly until about 1980s or so, then suddenly we realized, we need racial harmony. And then suddenly in schools, you started having Chinese orchestra, Indian orchestra, Malay orchestra, and then Chinese dance, Indian dance. And then the Chinese orchestra suddenly, or the Chinese music suddenly became a tool or a resource. What was once labeled as a communist entity is now a resource for racial harmony.
Yeah.
So in that sense,
that's crazy.
So as I say, if one studies history and one studies the literature that actually surrounds the history of Singapore's music, we can actually find a lot of details, and we can also find the way forward.
Yeah.
And so I find that Singapore is unique in the sense that we are fast-paced, but we are excellent innovators, superb innovators. And this is a DNA that has been carried from our forefathers all the way to present day. So I'm not reinventing the wheel. I'm basically looking back at the past and saying, what has been done? And I realized that whatever that you play is not China. It's not what is played in China. And so what I do currently right now is I just carry on the tradition of my forefathers, which is to continue innovating in that sense. And so a tradition is never stagnant. And if a tradition is stagnant, it will just pass out. Time just passes it out. A tradition is always evolving. And so in a sense, what I'm doing is I'm actually carrying on the same values of my forefathers, the first few migrants who actually came to Singapore in the 1920s or even 30s, all the way to now. And then subsequently, I'm creating my versions of Chinese music in that sense. And therefore, it became a very Singaporean identity. In fact, I didn't think that I was creating anything very Singaporean. It was only about 2016 or so that the Prime Minister actually sort of like said, oh, we created something uniquely Singapore. And then it's kind of clicked into me and I was like, did I do that? Or did I create something uniquely Singapore? And what was uniquely Singapore? You know, I don't mean the tagline from the STB. What is uniquely Singapore? And I didn't know. So for that, I went back to research. I mean, that's me, you know, I just go back to research. And then from there I found it was this idea of innovation that actually happened, this idea of social cohesion that actually happens. Because a lot of times these uncles and aunties, when they were making music, they were not looking out for the sound, but they were actually looking out for the camaraderie that they were working together. And this is something that I realize it's also in the DNA of Singaporeans. We don't talk about it very much, but a lot of times we gather together to make music because we enjoy each other's company. And then of course, good music, you know, works as a result. So these are basically some values which I identified, and I just basically took the spirit and then I created something new from it.
So you do think it's important for Singaporean music made in Singapore, the Singaporean Chinese music scene, to be independent of the mainland, you know, influences and have its own trajectory?
I think we like Western music already. For example, Gershwin, you know, he removed. Or American music, for example, when you went to pieces like John Cage, all the way to Copland, all the way to John Williams, you know, they have created their own sound of their own already in that sense. And so the instruments may have been European, but the sound is not necessarily that. And so similarly, like jazz also, it may have had its roots, you know, from one direction, but it has moved into an international platform. And now there's Japanese jazz and also Java, you know, and Indonesian jazz as well. And they're also asserting their own identity. We may be still using the scale, we may be still using the same instruments, but the way we play, the way we phrase, the way we assert ourselves, you know, the pieces that we play as well, also push or rather an exemplification of one's identity as well. What I find in Singapore that we do not have is that we don't have an appreciation of this identity. So there is a lot of people will just go immediately and say, oh, basically whoever shouts the loudest wins. So as Jeremy pointed out in the radio, if you have like 90% of the songs which are basically all Western, then that's about it. There's also another argument that I've also thought a little bit about. If we look at ASEAN, you realize that we are probably the only nation that actually sort of has a very predominant English pop or large English pop population. But if you go to Thailand, Thai pop is huge.
It's huge.
Indonesia. And you realize that that's because they actually have, they sing in their languages, in their native languages. And in Singapore, when we have our multicultural in that sense, and we pride ourselves in being multicultural, then we kind of have to bear with the fact that, that we are going to actually have to that we have multiple languages that are going to be happening. And the next thing is that then the English language pop will be compared, therefore, to all the English language pop that comes out in every other part of the world. The Chinese language pop will be compared to Hong Kong, Taiwan, China, in that sense. And so, therefore, all Chinese pop singers will go to Taiwan or wherever. And similarly, you know, on any of the Tamil top pop, you will be compared to all the music that comes from Hollywood and all that as well.
And it's a vicious cycle because as much as it's compared, the artists are unable to break away from it because now they have to adhere to that style in order to find placements in that playlisting and reach out to that artist.
So that's where I think like we have to ask ourselves, what is the future, you know? How do we work around this? How do we pass this impasse? And that's where I think that, you know, when we actually have a unique identity and a unique sound, so although we might be singing in English, but when you, this is very unique. This is a Singaporean sound. Like in the case where I was saying, like the Teochew group that was I was playing with, and probably between 2016 and 2017, they reformed their instruments. They played their own music and they created their own music, and then they propagated it among their own members in that sense. And what's to say that this music cannot be re-exported back to China? And then China can be able to play this music, for example. And similarly, whatever we create here,
something that can only be created here and played
something
here.
that can only be created here can be re-exported back to. So my music for mindfulness, which I created here, it's being re-exported elsewhere. And this is a funny thing. I have so much more support overseas than here.
Yeah, well, that's what we talked about. We don't have to, and I guess when you get this kind of support overseas is when you start to get listenership and appreciation at home as well. Even more appreciation.
The nationalist songs have really evolved, from the time of One People, One Nation, Count on Me, Singapore, Stand Up for Singapore, these songs, to, Home, and then The Road Ahead, songs like that, and in between, songs in other languages as well. And while, we explore the Singaporean identity through nationalist songs, I'm a strong believer that it should not be limited to just the national event or Chingay or these events. Like, we should be exploring the identity and leaning into our own culture. Anytime, every day, any day. It should we should not need an event to do something like that. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that if there is no nature on our side, then we need to nurture. So we do need these events, and they're extremely important. But I think we need more in that case, where it can be as we mentioned, concentrated effort where there's a lot of cross-pollination happening between institutions, schools, government, artists, and the public. And I can only hope that this can continue in breadth and depth. Any closing words? And you could also say, what is the one wild experiment you would like to do with the Singapore sound?
I think I'm already going to have a wild experiment. This coming concert that I'm actually having is my 20th anniversary concert. So we have commissioned 10 new original works from 20 creatives because it's 20th anniversary. And they are very, very weird. So I've commissioned Kelly Tang, all the way to Ko Cheng Jin, all the way to Chok Kerong, all the way to George Leong, all the way to Evan Low, all the way to Bang Wenfu. And so everybody has written a piece for the Teng Ensemble. And I think that experiment is actually, it's not easy because everybody's aesthetic is so different, and you work with all these different composers. And as a result of actually working with all these different composers, you actually realize that there is no one definitive Singaporean sound, but you actually have a confluence of multiple different identities that actually make a Singaporean sound. And I think what we need to do is that we actually need to celebrate the Singaporean identity.
Exactly. I love that. I love the project. I look forward to listening to the pieces.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Jeremy?
Oh, I don't know about wild projects. Having done this for 48 years,
You've been in the wilderness.
I had a lot of wild moments. Some I've lived to regret. But the thing is, what I'm trying to do now is to actually create or galvanize and catalyze the symphonic jazz movement. So in February, I released Singapore's first ever symphonic jazz album. And I was thinking to myself, when I did it and I checked that I could make that claim, it was ludicrous that we had to wait to 2024 to be able to say we have our first symphonic jazz album. Because, in the old days, when you say symphonic jazz, you think George Gershwin. Man, there's so much across the world. It's big in the US, it's big in Europe. To some extent, it's quite good in Japan, little less in Korea. But everywhere in Southeast Asia, there's not much thing of bringing. And why I want to do this is because I want to create a larger common space, bringing orchestral and symphony and classical musicians together with jazz musicians to create, firstly, a larger musician common space, and then for the listeners, because there's so many classical music listeners and fans, and then there's quite a number of jazz fans, and audience is growing, and to create this larger space, and I think it's important to create common spaces in a country like Singapore.
For sure.
And of course, infusing in this symphonic jazz our very rich cultural sounds that we have. And so really, it's a 5-year thing I'm trying to do, starting off with the album, which actually comes at the end of 10 years of experimentation. But then I don't just want to involve me. I want Chok Kerong, I want many other writers who've Jonathan Shin and so on and so forth, Rich Shee and all these people to come together and actually 5 years from now, now working with Resound, I want to work with OMM, I want to work with SEO, I want to work with the Singapore Symphony Orchestra and all the other groups. And so that's my current, if you will, obsession. And then to boot, because I don't have enough to do, I'm also just started a graduate diploma course in film scoring and orchestration.
Yeah, I saw that. You're on Zoom or something.
Yeah, today is my first lesson with my program leader. So we get a one session a week, not just the recorded lectures, but we get one-on-one session, which I think is fascinating. And so I'm very excited. We're going to record all the way from solo piano all the way to a 52-piece orchestra in November. And I can't wait to fly to Sofia, Bulgaria and sit in a control room and watch and listen to a 52 orchestra playing my work.
Oh, I love that. You're such an inspiration. Like, you have achieved so much and you don't have to do this, but you're doing this because, I guess that's what being a musician is all about.
Lifelong learning.
Lifelong learning, yeah. Who said that? When you stop learning, you start dying. Yeah. I love that, yeah. That's cool. And, the work that you've done through Jazzo, I personally know of several musicians who have received a scholarship. They went to study and they're in the industry right now. Yeah. So I love the fact that it's not just the opportunities that you have, but you always share it with people, and allowing an organization like Jazzo to help out musicians in the jazz scene, and what Teng is doing as well. And that's truly that Singaporean spirit, not just practicing and benefiting from it for ourselves, but also sharing it with others and bringing everyone together. Not just me. Let's all go together. Let's all climb up the ladder together. And I think that's truly the spirit of that Singaporean artist.
Thank you. And certainly I think we are part of a mutual admiration club. It's not one way.
Thank you. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for a very insightful conversation. Learned a lot today. And I really hope that, we form a collective consciousness about the Singapore sound, which is powered by identity, culture, roots, and a sense of confidence in ourselves and who we come from. Thank you. Thank you very much. There's no one bad dog.